أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا ربنا بما علمتنا وزدنا من كرمك علما يا أرحم الراحمين اللهم طهر قلوبنا وأزل عيوبنا وتولنا بالحسنى وزينا بالتقوى واجمع لنا خيري الآخرة والأولى وارزقنا طاعتك ما أبقيتنا يا رحمن يا رحيم اللهم أخرجنا من ظلمات الوهم وأكرمنا بنور الفهم وعلمنا بالحلم وزينا بالعلم واجعلنا من الذين يستمعون القول فيتبعون أحسنه يا ذا الجلال والإكرام اللهم افتح علينا فتوح العارفين ووفقنا توفيق الصالحين واجعلنا من المتقربين إليك على علم وهدى وبصيرة يا فتاح يا عليم وصل وسلم وبارك وأنعم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Inshallah ta'ala we'll continue in the text المنظومة الزمزمية في علم التفسير. We'll continue from where we stopped in the previous lesson, which is in the section on discussing meanings as it relates to rulings of the Sharia, in terms of how do we interpret the Qur'an for the sake of legal rulings. So he said he's going to discuss this in several segments. We're at the 8th segment, which is al-mafhum. Al-mafhum, here it says the implicit, which might not be a proper translation, because implicit covers several things. Not all of them are included in mafhum, when we talk about mafhum in this specific context. Implicit would include things like the logical entailment of something. That's implicit, it's not explicitly mentioned, but this is not what we're talking about. Certain ta'wil, if a word has several meanings, then which of those meanings? Sometimes it can be a meaning that's most likely, sometimes what can be referred to as the least likely meaning. All of these are implicit, but this is not what we're talking about when we're talking about mafhum. So implicit mightn't be the best translation. Mafhum is that which is not mentioned in the text, and the text doesn't cover it just by the words, but it gives a meaning or an implication that is applicable. That implication can either be in alignment with what is mentioned, or something the opposite of what is mentioned. So I'll give examples. The Qur'an says, وَلَا تَقُلْ لَهُمَا أُفٍّ. Don't say to your parents any bad word, uff. If somebody comes along and asks, what is the legal ruling in Sharia? What is the ruling about hitting your parents? So we'll say, you can't say to them a bad word. Why? Because it's harmful. Does hitting have that same meaning of harm? Yes. Therefore, this text implies or indicates that hitting is also not permissible. That hitting is not mentioned in the text because the text says, لا تقل لهما أف. But does it give the meaning that is also present in hitting? Yes. So this is mafhum. We say we understand this from the text. This ruling aligns with the text in terms of its meaning. Then this is called mafhum al-muwafaqa, where the implicit meaning aligns with the meaning of the explicit text. Then you have mafhum al-mukhalafa. If you scroll down in the notes, there's a table at the bottom. You have mafhum al-mukhalafa. Mafhum al-mukhalafa is where the implied meaning is opposite to what is mentioned in the text. So mafhum al-muwafaqa, muwafaqa means it is aligned with, it is the same meaning. Wafaqa means to agree with. So the meaning is in agreement, the implicit meaning is in agreement with the explicit text. Mukhalafa comes from the word khalafa, which means to go against. This is where the implied meaning is others, the opposite of the explicit text, what is mentioned in the text. An example of that from the Sunnah, in the Shafi'i school, if najasa makes contact with a small amount of water, the water becomes najis. Why do we say a small, and we define a small amount as anything less than qullatan. Modern calculations of qullatan, about 216. From 190 to about 260 liters of water. How do we end up with this? So the Prophet ﷺ says in the hadith, إِذَا بَلَغَ الْمَاءُ قُلَّتَانْ لَمْ يَحْمِلْ خَبَثًا. If water reaches 2 qullas, then it does not carry impurities. Now the explicit text, yani when we say explicit, what is actually mentioned? What is actually mentioned is if water reaches X amount, it does not carry najasa. What is implied by that? Is that if it does not reach that amount, then it does carry najasa. So this is called mafhum al-mukhalafa. This is not mentioned in the text. The words of the hadith didn't say this. The word of the hadith says, gives the opposite ruling. So the words of the hadith says, when it reaches this, it does not carry najasa. So the implication of that is that if it does not reach that, then it does carry najasa. So this is called mafhum al-mukhalafa. Following so far? So now mafhum al-muwafaqa, there are many categories of mafhum al-mukhalafa that the author will mention in the poem. Mafhum al-muwafaqa has 2 categories. The first category is when the implicit meaning, the implicit meaning, or one of the implicit meanings, is at the exact same level of what is mentioned in the text. If it's at the exact same level of what is mentioned in the text, then this is called lahnul khitab. Lahn al-khitab. If you look at the table, if you can't follow the table, I can do it on the board. But if you can follow on the table, then that's... This is where... So for example, the Qur'an says, do not eat the wealth of the orphans. La ta'kulu. Meaning don't waste it. If somebody says, what is the ruling? Somebody comes and he asks a faqih. We see in the Qur'an, it says don't eat, meaning don't use it to excessively on yourself. If somebody comes and says, what is the ruling on burning it? The Qur'an says don't waste it, but what about burning it? That they say we didn't see that in the Qur'an. Also, don't waste it means what? Don't use it up in a way that's not beneficial. Is burning it, using it up in a way that's not beneficial? Yeah. So that's exactly the same thing. So this is called lahnul khitab. So we'll say that the ruling of the second issue is in the Qur'an. Although if somebody reads the Qur'an from the beginning to the end, they won't find that. We say no, the ruling is in the Qur'an. Because of the implication, which is, so on this issue is exactly equivalent to the one mentioned in the Qur'an. This is called lahnul khitab. And then if it is of a more severe degree than the one mentioned in the Qur'an, then it's called fahwa al-khitab. It's just nomenclatures. So in other words, we still say it is mentioned in the Qur'an because the same illah, the same legal determinant is mentioned in the Qur'an. So if you find an issue that fulfills that same legal determinant to a higher level, then the same ruling applies. And the evidence is the Qur'an that mentions the illah of the issue. So this is important to understand for many reasons. One is people who always talk about dalil, and they want verses of the Qur'an for every single issue. If the Qur'an was to address every single issue, when would the Qur'an end? We wouldn't even have a hafiz of the Qur'an, right? Because the Qur'an will keep going on and going on. So the Qur'an, we have to extract some of these rulings from the Qur'an. So when we talk about mafhum, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the implications of what is mentioned in the Qur'an. So it's not explicitly mentioned, but it is implied in the Qur'an. And the ulama differ on the mafhum of the Qur'an, whether it is used as evidence in Sharia or not. So there's an agreement on mafhum al-muwafaqa. The first type that we mentioned, mafhum al-muwafaqa, where what is implied is aligned with what is mentioned in the Qur'an. This type is agreed upon by the fuqaha as being evidences, as legal evidence in Sharia. Where they differ is on whether that type, the evidence is by the word of the Qur'an or is it by inference. So they agree it's dalil. They agree that this is a type of evidence. They differ whether it's qiyasi or it's lafzi. Are we going to say that the words cover all of those ahkam or by inference? But they agree that mafhum al-muwafaqa is evidence. Where they differ is on mafhum al-mukhalafa. Is mafhum al-mukhalafa, where what is implied, the opposite of what is mentioned, like the hadith, the example we gave, is that legally, is that an evidence in the Sharia or not? So here we have a difference of opinion. The Shafi'i ulama accept this as legal evidence, and the Hanafis do not. But I don't know the details of their madhab. But in general, they say the Hanafis don't accept it as evidence, but the Shafi'is accept it as evidence, but we have certain conditions. In the notes, we have some of the conditions. We'll just read them quickly. One is that it is not mentioned in reference to a norm. If something is normally the case, and we describe that norm, it is not to exclude that norm. وَرَبَائِكُمُ اللَّاتِي فِي Anyway, so I don't want to give examples. I don't want to stretch the lesson out too much. But that is not mentioning a norm. If it is the norm, let's say, I'll give an example that's not related to the Qur'an or the Sunnah. If I say, be kind to your neighbor that shares your fence. When they build the houses, some houses in some countries are joined together, or the fence is one fence. So if I say to you, be kind to your neighbor who shares your fence, that does not mean if your neighbor does not share your fence, don't be kind to them. Right? Because if I mention this, is to describe what is the norm. It's not to say other than that, don't be kind. So if there's like an alleyway there's a fence, a little alleyway, another fence, don't be kind to that guy. That's not what we're talking. So if it's mentioned just to mention a norm, then we don't take from it any mafhum al-mukhalafa. If it is mentioned to indicate a favor from Allah Azza wa Jal, then that is not, in the Qur'an it talks about Allah Azza wa Jal made the oceans for us, the seas, so that you can eat from it lahman tariya. You can eat from it fresh meat. The word fresh here is not to say that if it is not fresh, you cannot eat it. The word fresh here is not used to indicate that the ruling does not apply to the opposite. The word here is just used to indicate the favor of Allah Azza wa Jal to people. That you can go, in other words, the ocean preserves the meat for you. So if we find a dead fish in the ocean, can we eat it? If we find a dead animal, a dead whale, a dead shark, a dead mermaid, can we eat it? Yes. As long as it's not, if the meat didn't change and it start to stink as it's harmful, as long as that didn't happen, we can eat it. Because the Prophet ﷺ, when he was asked, what did he say? The dead of it is halal. So the Qur'an is not saying the non-fresh one cannot be eaten. So it was mentioned, if a word is mentioned just to mention the favor of Allah, then we don't take from it a mafhum. That is not mentioned to extol something, to show the grandeur of something. Wala, when it talks about the rules of i'tikaf, and it says don't come close to them, don't have any marital interaction. وَأَنْتُمْ عَاكِفُونَ فِي الْمَسَاجِدِ. The word fil masajid here is not to say that if you're, let's say the mu'takif, the person who's doing i'tikaf, he can leave the masjid for reasons. It's not saying if you leave the masjid but you're still in i'tikaf that you can, it's not saying that. This is just to show the status of the masjid. So if it's mentioned just to show the status of something, then we don't take from it a legal implication. That it is not mentioned in response to any specific question or incident. If somebody asks a specific question and the Qur'an gives the answer, then anything in that answer, we don't take a legal mafhum from it because it's responding to a specific question. So if the specific question has certain qualifications and the Qur'an addresses those qualifications, we don't take from that any legal implications. That it is not mentioned to inform people of a specific unknown ruling. Let's say they know certain rulings, they didn't know some, and the Qur'an indicates those. We don't take from that a mafhum. That it isn't mentioned to emphasize something that's already the case. If the Qur'an mentions something that is already the reality, then we don't take from that a legal implication. So these are some of the conditions in the Shafi'i school for using mafhum al-mukhalafa. We'll go to the text. So the author, rahimahullah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he mentions, he says, موافق منطوقه كأف ومنه ذو تخالف في الوصف. So he said that there are, of it is that which agrees with the explicit like uff, and of it is that which disagrees in quality. Basically he's giving us the two categories of mafhum that we just mentioned, muwafaqa and mukhalafa. Mafhum al-muwafaqa, we said, is where the implication is aligned with the explicit text in its meaning. The example he gave is uff, like the Qur'an that says وَلَا تَقُلْ لَهُمَا uff, don't say to them uff. The mafhum al-muwafaqa would be don't do anything that harms your parents. So anything that involves harm would share the ruling as what is mentioned in the Qur'an, which is لَا تَقُلْ لَهُمَا uffin, even if it's emotional harm, even if they don't say that it harms them, even if we suspect that it harms them and they say it doesn't harm me or it doesn't bother me, but we suspect that they're not telling the truth. We can't do anything that harms the parents because the Qur'an says لَا تَقُلْ لَهُمَا uff, don't say to them uff. So even if somebody says, okay, I'm not going to say anything to them, the Qur'an says don't say. I'm not going to say anything, I'm going to look at them like, you can't do that. That's not permissible in Sharia. You can't look at them in a bad way. What about thinking about them? The Qur'an isn't saying anything about thinking. You're not even there. They can't see your facial expressions. They can't hear what you say. You remember your mother and you just have a bad thought. It's permissible? If the thought just comes like that, you're not held responsible for it. If you keep that thought and you actively engage in it, then it becomes a problem. Because now it's your doing. You're not held accountable for what you don't do. So a thought that just comes to you, that's not, you didn't do that. That came to you. But once you start to actively, so now a bad thought came, you start to imagine it through. How am I going to do X, Y, Z to me? That's not permissible. لا تقل لهما أف. So that's mafhum al-muwafaqa. And he said, and of it, yani another type of it, is that which disagrees with the quality mentioned in the text. In other words, mafhum al-mukhalafa. This is where the opposite is implied. So the explicit text mentions X, but it implies the ruling of Y, meaning by being the opposite. So and then he says, so basically this is fil wasfi. He's giving some types of mafhum al-mukhalafa. So one of the types he gave is a sifa, it's a quality. Is a quality. So sometimes it'll mention a quality. The opposite of it will be the anything that does not have that quality. So if somebody says to you, for example, make wudu with pure water. Make wudu with pure water. What does that mean? In terms of mukhalafa, what would be the opposite? It means don't make wudu with other than pure water. So the text would say, by text here I mean this statement. In the example, this is not a Quranic example, it's just an example to convey the point. The exact words used is is only make wudu with pure water. The implication would be don't make wudu with other than pure water. So any question that comes to your mind where the liquid in question is other than pure water, what would be the ruling? You go back to what was the explicit text? Only make with pure. So the answer for anything else becomes, we can't. If somebody says, can I use coconut water to make wudu? You come back, only pure. No. Coconut water, no. Because that text implies, do not with anything else. So it might be a quality, a sifa, like that, pure. That's a description. Or it could be a limit. It could be a limit. If somebody says, the Qur'an says, wash up to the elbows when you're making wudu. Now, if somebody asks the question, what about if I wash only up to here? It's like, what was the limit mentioned in the Qur'an? Here. It's like anything that doesn't reach there is not fulfilling what is mentioned in the Qur'an. So it might be a description, it might be a limit, it might be a condition. It might be a condition. If somebody asks the Mufti, can I slap somebody? And the Mufti said, if he does X, Y, Z, then. Now you're thinking, so it means if he doesn't, you can't. So it might be and if somebody attacks you, then fight them. That means if somebody doesn't attack you, you can't go fight them. So it might be something, it might be a condition like that. So, yeah. And then he said wasf, that's one type, which is a description. And then he says, and like this, يعني ومثل ذا شرط وغاية عدد وَنَبَأُ الْفَاسِقِ لِلْوَصْفِ وَرَدْ. So he says, and like this meaning, like a description, there is also condition, limit, and number. Condition, limit, and number. He's going to give examples for each. So now he starts to give the examples from the Qur'an. He says, وَنَبَأُ الْفَاسِقِ لِلْوَصْفِ وَرَدْ. An example of the description in the Qur'an, where from a description we have the implication of what is other than that. The example he gave is in the Qur'an. It says, إِذَا جَاءَكُمْ فَاسِقٌ بِنَبَإٍ فَتَبَيَّنُوا. If a fasiq, people would translate fasiq as a wicked person. If a wicked person comes to you with any news, then verify. Now, the word wicked doesn't do justice because our understanding of wicked is subjective. Fasiq means by Sharia is anybody who commits a major sin. Anybody who commits minor sins consistently without tawbah. Consistently means 4 times or more without tawbah in between. or somebody who does not maintain the standard mannerisms, the ethics of his status at his time, of his status at a certain time in a certain place. So when we say maintain the manners of his status, we're talking about, for example, what is expected from an alim is not the same as what is expected from a construction worker, with no disrespect to construction workers. The ethics are different. People would be, if a construction worker eats lunch in public while standing, people might be more forgiving than if you see an alim standing on the road eating food. Because we expect a higher standards from teachers, we expect a higher standards from government workers, stuff like that. If your president does X, everybody is upset. And they might be doing the exact same action themselves. But it's like, no, we can't accept that from a leader. So they have to maintain the standard mannerisms as long as it does not contradict anything in the Sharia. So anybody who commits a major sin, consistently commits minor sins, or does not implement the mannerisms expected from him at a certain place in a certain time, that person is considered a fasiq by Sharia. So that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about, like, they don't have to be extremely wicked. If somebody that fits that description comes to you with a news, the Qur'an says, verify. What do we understand from that? We understand that if a non-fasiq, if a trustworthy person comes, then we don't have to verify. If there's a need to verify, then maybe that person is not trustworthy. But the trustworthiness eliminates the need for verification. Because that's the whole meaning of trustworthy. We can trust you. And this is one of the verses in the Qur'an that the muhaddithun who say that we can, and the fuqaha who say that we can accept a solitary narration of hadith, they use this ayah as evidence. There's a dispute if we can accept a hadith that is narrated from one person to one person to one person to one person to the Prophet ﷺ. Can we accept that? Because we're depending on just single people all the time. So some of the muhaddithun, they use this ayah. So if it's adl, if it's a trustworthy, from a trustworthy, from a trustworthy, from a trustworthy, then we have to, because the Qur'an says that you only verify if they're not trustworthy. إِذَا جَاءَكُمْ فَاسِقٌ. So that's an example of wasf, of a description. And then he says, وَالشَّرْطُ إِن كُنَّ أُولَاتِ حَمْلٍ وَغَايَةٌ جَاءَتْ بِنَفْيِ حِلِّ. So he says, an example of quality that has occurred. Oh no, that's the other one. And of condition, an example of a condition, those with child, meaning if somebody divorces a wife, when somebody divorces a wife, she can either be taken back within a certain period or not, right? If she can be taken back within a certain period, then the expenditure for her is on the husband. It's still obligatory for him to take care of all of her needs. The way, not all of her needs, but the needs that are stipulated by Sharia. But if he cannot take her back, she is not a raj'iyya, the separation is complete. Let's say, for example, he gave 3 divorces. He doesn't have any more. This is complete. He doesn't have to take care of that woman. She's not raj'iyya. Except if she is pregnant. So this, if she is pregnant, that's a condition. So if she is pregnant, then you have to. This if and then, if this, then that, this is a condition. If this condition is present, then this ruling is present. So he's saying this is an example of condition. What will be the implication? The text says, وَإِن كُنَّ أُولَاتِ حَمْلٍ فَأَنْفِقُوا عَلَيْهِنَّ حَتَّى يَضَعْنَ حَمْلَهُنَّ. And if they are with child, meaning if they are pregnant, if they're expecting a child, then أَنْفِقُوا عَلَيْهِنَّ, then you have to give nafaqah, you have to spend on them until the child is born. What does that imply that if they are not, so the condition is if they are this, then that. The implication will be if they are not this, then not that. And if this condition is not present, then that ruling is also not present, because that ruling is conditioned on this condition. That ruling is contingent on the presence of a condition. So that will be an example of a condition. وَغَايَةٌ جَاءَتْ بِنَفْيِ حِلٍّ. And an example of limit, he said, is the negation of permissibility. The language is rough because it's a poem. So if you don't try to just understand when I explain the poem. But if you just read the words of the poem, sometimes you don't get what he's trying to say. So an example of ghaya, an example of where we take the implication from a limit that is mentioned in the explicit text is, he said, the negation of permissibility for her husband before marrying another. Meaning, if somebody divorces a woman 3 times and the divorce is complete, then in order for him to marry that woman again, 5 things has to happen. Right? 5 things have to happen. It's not permissible. So the 5 things will be, she have to complete her iddah from him. So that will be complete. She has to marry another person with a valid marriage. They must consummate that marriage. The new marriage must be consummated. That's how many? 3. The 4th is she must be divorced from that second husband. And then the 5th is she must complete her iddah from that divorce. Only if this is done, then this person can marry that woman again. And the stringency in this is to prevent people from just divorcing just like that. So he's saying that will be an example of limit. Because the Qur'an is saying it's not permissible for you to marry them until this happens. So the implication would be what? If this doesn't happen, then you cannot marry them. And then he says, and like 80, an example of number to complete the example. Should it be an and not and? So the example of where we take an implication, a mafhum mukhalafa, from a number that's mentioned in the Qur'an, he says the example is like 80. The Qur'an says فَجْلِدُوهُمْ ثَمَانِينَ جَلْدَةً. The person who commits qadaf. فَجْلِدُوهُمْ ثَمَانِينَ جَلْدَةً. It says give them 80 lashes. 80 would imply what? Nothing other than 80. So nothing below and nothing above. So if somebody comes and say to the qadi, what is the ruling on 79? The qadi can't look in the Quran and say, I have to find a specific evidence that says not 79, not 78, not 76, not 70. The Quran says 80, that means anything that's not 80, the Quran is saying no. Because the ruling is attached to 80. Anything that's not that, the ruling is not applied to it. So فَجْلِدُوهُمْ ثَمَانِينَ جَلْدَةً. That's 18. He said that's an example of a number from which we have the implication of other than that number. Then he goes on to the next section. You have to go to the other lesson now, the other lesson 10.
Do you have the ayah for the examples? Do you have the ayah of the Qur'an for the example?
No. You mean the exact places of the ayat?
Yes.
Afterwards we look for them. Yeah, so now we move to the lesson 10 notes. So he said the التاسع والعاشر المطلق والمقيد. the 9th and the 10th sections on al-mutlaq wal-muqayyad. Al-mutlaq wal-muqayyad is when something is mentioned absolutely and something is qualified. Al-mutlaq means absolute. There's no restrictions, there's no limitations, there's no qualifications. And muqayyad is where there are qualifications mentioned. So here there are some differences and there are different sections. We need to understand when he talks about them, what exactly or which section is he talking about? What category is he talking about? So if something is mentioned absolutely in the Qur'an and it's not restricted at any point in the Qur'an and it's not restricted at all, then we keep it on its unrestricted, unqualified meaning. We don't qualify the meaning at all. So anything mentioned in the Qur'an, mutlaqan means unqualified, is just mentioned in general, then we keep it with its general meaning. Nobody can restrict that meaning. And that is by agreement of the ulama. There is no difference of opinion concerning that. If it is mentioned restricted throughout the Qur'an, then we keep it the restricted meaning, and nobody is allowed to open that meaning beyond the limits that has been placed on it. If something is qualified with a certain qualification throughout the Qur'an, and at no point in the Qur'an was it mentioned without the qualifications, without being restricted, then nobody can unrestrict that meaning. Nobody can take the meaning out of the restricted senses and apply it to anything else. So if it's mutlaq without restriction, we accept it as absolute. If it is restricted without at any point being opened up, then we take it as being restricted, and there is no difference of opinion among the ulama concerning the two. If it is mentioned in some places in the Qur'an with a qualification and in other places without a qualification, then here we'll end up with three cases. That can happen in three ways. Now, in one category, there are those where all of the ulama agree that the absolute, if it is mentioned absolutely in the Qur'an in one part, that we will restrict it by the restriction mentioned in another part. So there are some categories. There's one category where all of the ulama agree that the general mentioning of it in the Qur'an will be qualified by the one that was mentioned with the qualification. Then there's another category where all of the ulama agree that the one that was mentioned without the restriction will not be qualified by the mentioning of it with the qualification. Just try to follow that we're talking about where something is mentioned in the Qur'an, one part of it, in one mentioning, one surah, one ayah, it is mentioned generally, in another ayah it is mentioned with a restriction. Sometimes all of the ulama would agree that the general mentioning will be qualified by the one that is qualified. And another set, all of the ulama agree that it will not be qualified. These are two separate texts. We would not qualify the absolute text with the one that is mentioned with a qualification. A third category is where they differ. That's the one that the author will mention in the poem. And that is, there's some mentioning in the Qur'an, there are some instances in the Qur'an where something is mentioned in one part of the Qur'an without any restrictions, without any qualification. And in another ayah, sometimes in a different surah, it is mentioned with a qualification. Some of the ulama in this category would say that the absolute one, the one that is mentioned, where the ruling is mentioned absolutely, must be qualified by the ayah that mentions it with a qualification. And some of the ulama would say no. Now this happens in a case where we have a ruling that is being mentioned, So you have the ruling and you have the reason for the ruling. If the reason for the ruling and the ruling itself is the same in both verses, then the ulama agree that the restriction will apply to both verses. In terms of the ruling, we would recite the one that is mentioned absolutely, and we'll recite the one that is mentioned with the qualification, but in terms of the ruling of the Sharia, the qualification would apply across the board. If the ruling is different and the reason for the ruling is different, then the one that is mentioned absolutely would not be restricted by the one that is mentioned with the qualification, because they have nothing to do with one another. It's a whole different ruling, and this one is a whole different ruling, and the reason for this ruling is different from the reason for this ruling. It's mentioned in the notes, so you can read it back if it gets a bit confusing. Then the last category now is where we have an agreement in the ruling or the reason for the ruling. In other words, in a case where you have one verse of the Qur'an mentions a ruling absolutely, in another part of the Qur'an is mentioned with a qualification, and both texts, either the ruling is the same but the reason is different, or the reason is the same and the ruling is different. Here is where the ulama differ. For example, in one part of the Qur'an, when it talks about wudu, it says wash the hands up to the elbow. When it talks about tayammum, it just says wash the hands. So when the verse of tayammum just says wash the hands, hands is not qualified here. It's not saying which part of the hands. It's just saying wash hands. So what does that mean? Do I wash in tayammum? Do I wash the entire thing that is called a hand? In wudu, it gives a qualification. It gives a restriction. So now here we have the ruling. The ruling, if we were to look at the verses, the ruling is not the same, because one is saying up to the elbow, the other one is not saying that, it's just saying hands. But the reason for the ruling is the same. The reason for making wudu is the same reason for making tayammum. You have a hadath that prevents the validity of prayer. So you have this virtual thing that clings to parts of the body that prevents the validity of prayer. This is the definition of hadath. In order to permit prayer, you have to go through a ritual purification to remove that hadath. So the reason you're making wudu is the same reason you're making tayammum. So here, some of the ulama, this is where you have a difference of opinion among the ulama, because you have two texts that's mentioning the same ruling, that's mentioned that one restricts the hands, the other doesn't. The reason for the ruling is the same, but the ruling in the verse is not the same. So do we restrict the one that is not restricted by the one that is restricted, given the fact that the reason for the rulings are the same? Here is where we have a difference of opinion among the ulama. In the Shafi'i school, we would. This is why in the Shafi'i school, when we make tayammum, we go up to the elbow as well, up to and beyond. When we say up to in the Shafi'i school, we mean a bit beyond. So in the Shafi'i school, we would restrict the one that is not mentioned, that is not restricted by the one that is restricted, if they agree in either the reason for the ruling or the ruling itself. So either they agree in the ruling and differ in the reason, or they agree in the reason and differ in the ruling. In either case, in the Shafi'i school, we would restrict the unrestricted one with the same qualification as the restricted one. So,
It's not restricted. Why not the mazhab?
In the other madhabs, some of them no. They don't restrict. In some madhabs, they only do the wrist up to here in some of the madhabs. And I think that's the Hanbali school. I don't know the others. I don't know what they say in terms of how to wipe it. So we go back to the text. So he said, rahimahullah ta'ala, وَحَمْلُ مُطْلَقٍ عَلَى الضِّدِّ إِذَا أَمْكَنْ فَالْحُكْمُ لَهُ قَدْ أُخِذَ. He said, if it is possible to interpret the absolute in light of its opposite will be the qualified. Its ruling for it is taken. Yani its ruling for the unqualified is taken. Meaning we take the ruling from the qualified one and we apply it to the unqualified one. So he says, إِذَا أَمْكَنْ, if it is possible. So when it becomes possible, that's a whole chapter to study in the books of Usul al-Fiqh. Because of agreement in the ruling or the reason for the ruling and stuff like that. So he says, وَحَمْلُ مُطْلَقٍ عَلَى الضِّدِّ إِذَا أَمْكَنْ فَالْحُكْمُ لَهُ قَدْ أُخِذَ. So if it's possible, then we restrict the unrestricted one with the qualification of the restricted verses. كَالْقَتْلِ وَالظِّهَارِ حَيْثُ قَيَّدَتْ أُولَاهُمَا مُؤْمِنَةٌ إِذَا وَرَدَتْ. So he gives an example. He says, like the kafara of killing and the kafara of zihar. The kafara of killing and the kafara means atonement. So basically, to atone for killing and for zihar. Zihar was a type of divorce that existed in Jahili Arabia. That basically what you'll do is a man will say to his wife that you have become to me like my mother. Which means somebody cannot have certain relationship with their mother. So he's basically divorcing the wife through that phrase. So in the Sharia, when the Prophet ﷺ came, he did not apply, he didn't keep this ruling that the Jahilis have completely, but he didn't throw it out completely. So there's a whole process of dealing with it in the Sharia. It's called zihar. Anyway, because I don't want to stray, I don't want to get into the details of it. But at the end of the day, if the person takes back the wife in front of a qadi and they go through the process, there's a penalty that he has to give. So when it talks about the penalty in the case of the murder, when you kill somebody by accident, killing somebody by accident meaning you used a thing that would usually kill in a manner that would not usually kill, and it resulted in a death. So you didn't mean to kill the person. So there's a penalty that has to be paid. So in that ayah it says the penalty is فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ مُؤْمِنَةٍ. فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ مُؤْمِنَةٍ. The freeing of a Muslim slave. But when it talks about the kafara for zihar, it did not use the word mu'mina. So فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ. So in one it says تَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ مُؤْمِنَةٍ, to free a Muslim slave, a believing slave. In the other ayah it says to free a slave. Now do we take the restriction or the qualification of believing and apply it to the verse that did not mention believing? So one says believing slave, the other does not. Now do we apply believing to both, or do we treat each separately? Do we say that the kafara for a mistake killing is the freeing of a believing slave, but the kafara for zihar is to free a slave, believing or not? So that's how some of the fuqaha did it. In the Shafi'i school, we restricted it. So we applied that qualification to both, because the ruling is the same. What is the ruling? it's kafara for something that you've done. The reason is different. The reason, one is killing and the other one is dhihar. But with the Shafi'is, we say if it agrees in either the ruling or the reason for the ruling, then we carry over the restriction. So that's just an example that he gave. As related to the first verse of the poem that says, إِذَا أَمْكَنْ, if it is possible. This is an example of where in the Shafi'i school we believe it's possible. Why? Because there's an agreement in ruling. And then both cases must be in the Shafi'i school, must be a believing slave. Yeah. وحيث لا يمكن كالقضاء في شهر الصيام حكمه لا يقتفي لا تقتفي. But when it is not possible, when it is impossible, like the make-up fasts in the month of Ramadan, its ruling does not apply. Meaning, when it's not possible to take the qualification from one and apply it to the other, then we do not take the qualification from one and apply it to the other. The example he gave is making up fasts in Ramadan. So, in the verses of fasting, it says if you can't fast, then فَعِدَّةٌ مِّنْ أَيَّامٍ أُخَرٍ, then you make it up in other days. It didn't say which other days. Just make it up. And it didn't say how. That verse in the Qur'an didn't say if you have to do it day after day consecutively. And it didn't say which days. It just says make it up on other days. Now, if you look in the rest of the Qur'an to find if at any other parts of the Qur'an, when you have to do fast as to make up for something, is it qualified by any qualification at all? Because the one that talks about fasting in the month of Ramadan didn't mention anything. So if you check the entire Qur'an, you will find two qualifications for two different things. So one, it says فَصِيَامُ شَهْرَيْنِ مُتَتَابِعِينَ. The kafara for yameen, it says to fast 2 months consecutively. And then when it talks about the dam for Hajj, tamattu', it says فَالصِّيَامُ ثَلَاثَةِ أَيَّامٍ فِي الْحَجِّ وَالسَّبَعَةٍ إِذَا رَجَعْتُمْ. You fast 10 days. You fast 3 of those 10 days in the Hajj, and you fast 7 of those days when you go back home. Tilka asharatun kamila. That is 10 complete days. So now you have, in one ayah, it's restricted, but the restriction is different. The qualification is different. In another ayah, it is restricted. So one restricted 3, take a break, then 7. Another ayah says 2 months consecutively without any break. And then the verse of fasting in the month of Ramadan didn't mention anything. So now if you have two different qualifications, you have to ask, is either of those qualifications prior in relation to making up the fasting of the month of Ramadan? Is making up the fasting in the month of Ramadan closer legally to either of these two? And the answer is no. So then, can we restrict it by both? No. So, what do? We leave it unrestricted, and we treat each one of these texts as separate. These are separate things, to each their own ruling. So, because we have two qualifications, and neither of them are prior legally, the qiyas to neither is closer than the other in relation to the making up of the fasting of Ramadan. So because of that, it renders it impossible legally to apply either restriction or either qualification to the verse of Siyam. So we leave the verse of Siyam as it is and the ruling as it is. So we say to make up the fast of Ramadan is, as mentioned in the Qur'an, make it up on other days, whether consecutively or not. Whether you do it all in 1 month or a few days in 1 month and a few, it doesn't matter. You have 30 days or how many ever days you have to make them up whenever you can. وحيث لا يمكن كالقضاء في شهر رمضان حكمه لا تقتفي. Then he moves on to, you guys okay, or you want a little break? Or no, keep going. So then he moves on to, he said والحادي عشر والثاني عشر الناسخ والمنسوخ. So the 11th and the 12th segments, the abrogating and the abrogated verses. الناسخ والمنسوخ. الناسخ والمنسوخ, or النسخ, the abrogation is the removal of a ruling and the replacing of it with another ruling. That's the standard definition. The ulama differ concerning the second part of that. In other words, is naskh only the removing of a ruling? Or is it necessary for it to be naskh that that ruling is replaced by a second one? So that's a matter of difference among the ulama. But the idea of naskh is the removal of a ruling from the Qur'an. And then another ayah will come to indicate how we proceed from the removal of that hukum. And one of the conditions is that, so some of the ulama included in naskh, and some of them say it's a condition of naskh, that the abrogating verse comes after the abrogated verse. It is natural. If this one's going to abrogate, there must be something there to be abrogated. So that order has to be there in order for us to know that it's naskh. And technically, naskh only applies to rulings of the Sharia, only to a command or a prohibition. Technically, we'll use the word naskh when we discuss it generally, but technically it only applies to the commands of Allah Azza wa Jalla, the command to do or the command not to do. The ulama agree that naskh is possible. The ulama agree that naskh, abrogation, in the revelation, divine revelation, in Allah Azza wa Jal revealing to His prophets, whichever prophet, something and then cancelling that with another text and replacing the ruling, rationally, it's called aqlan, rationally we have no objection to this. This is rationally possible. Because Allah Azza wa Jal yaf'al ma yurid. Allah Azza wa Jal does whatever He wants. So rationally, Allah Azza wa Jal can command something now and then command the opposite later. That's not rationally impossible. Did it ever happen in the Qur'an? So the ulama agree that it's possible. But did it actually happen in the Qur'an? By agreement of the ulama, it did. Naskh happened in the Qur'an. Nobody denies this except Abu Muslim al-Asfahani, and his opinion is not seriously counted. So basically what we have is, by the agreement of the ulama, naskh occurred in the Qur'an. Naskh would mean abrogation. The author, he said, كم صنفوا في ذين من أسفار واشتهرت في الضخم والإكثار. So how many volumes have been written concerning these two, meaning nasikh wal mansukh, concerning abrogation there are many volumes that have been written in the Islamic knowledge tradition. And he said, and they are well known and their perniciousness, for their perniciousness and plentifulness. Basically what he's trying to say is that this is not something, the ulama have talked about this so many, from the very early ulama, there are many books that have been written concerning abrogation in the Qur'an. The earlier books would include books by Abu Ubaid, Al-Qasim ibn As-Salam, Abu Dawood As-Sijistani, Abu Ja'far Al-Nuhas, Ibn Al-Abyari, Ibn Al-Anbari, Makki ibn Abi Talib, Al-Qadi Abu Bakr ibn Al-Arabi, from among the later ulama. Ibn Hazm wrote about this, Al-Maqarri. There are many books written on Al-Naskh, Nasikh wal-Mansukh. And then he said, وَنَاسِخٌ مِّن بَعْدِ مَنْسُوخٍ أَتَى تَرْتِيبُهُ إِلَّا الَّذِي قَدْ ثَبَتَ. The abrogating text comes after the one that's abrogated in order, except the one that has been established. What he's saying is that in terms of revelation, in terms of when the Prophet ﷺ was alive and the Qur'an was coming to him directly, the nasikh verses, the abrogating verses, came after the abrogated verses. That has to be the case. But in the Qur'an itself, now in the compilation of the Qur'an, after the Qur'an has been arranged and has its specific order, and we spoke about the ordering of the Qur'an in the early lessons, he's saying that this is maintained. In the Qur'an, the nasikh verses come after the mansukh verses, except in, he said, except in one case. In the books of usul, the ulama would mention other cases. In some of the books they won't mention. Now why he only mentioned this one is because this one is by agreement. The ulama, first of all, will differ concerning naskh itself. Not every verse that somebody says is nasikh and mansukh is not agreed upon. There are many times where the ulama some of them would say this verse abrogated that verse, and other fuqaha would say it's not an abrogation at all. So not every case of abrogation is agreed upon. So some of them in the books of usul will give other examples in the Qur'an where the mansukh verse comes after the nasikh, where the abrogated comes after the abrogating. But he mentioned only one because this is a case of nasakh that is agreed upon by the ulama. So he said, except the one that has been established. من آية العدة لا يحل لك النساء صح فيه النقل. So he said the one that's agreed upon is the verse of Al-Iddah. The verse where the women whose husbands passed away, they have a mourning period of, one ayah says a year. And then that has been abrogated with the ayah that says 4 months and 10 days. But in the tartib of the Mus'haf, in the Qur'an itself now, we'll find that the abrogated verse comes after the abrogating verse, which in reality the opposite, it happened in the opposite way, but in the tartib of the Mus'haf, you get the point. So the abrogated verse is 240 in Surah Al-Baqarah. And the abrogating verse is 234. So 240 and 234. The mansukh verse, the abrogated verse is 240, Surah Al-Baqarah, and the abrogating verse is verse 234 in Surah Al-Baqarah. And then he gives an example of one that's sahih, but there's a difference of opinion among the ulama. The other example is it being a case of abrogation is transmitted in a sahih transmission. So majority of the ulama accept it as a case of naskh. But some of the companions radiallahu ta'ala anhum did not think that this was a case of nasikh and mansukh. But he gives the example, he says, Sahha and naql, the transmission of it being nasikh and mansukh is authentic or has been rigorously verified. So that example he says, لا يحل لك النساء صح فيه النقل. The verse in Surah Al-Ahzab, verse 52, it says, to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, لا يحل لك النساء من بعد ولا أن تبدل بهن من أزواج. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he chose the 9 wives and they chose him, Allah Azza wa Jalla says, beyond them, no other woman is permissible for you. You're not permitted to marry other women, and you're not permitted to exchange them. This is something in the Arab Jahili culture, one of the things that were prevalent is that they would swap wives by contract. So men would just meet and I give you my wife for your wife, and they would agree, and then that's it. The women will be exchanged. So this is something obviously not permitted in Islam. So the verse says you're not permitted beyond the 9, nor to exchange them or to get others. Let's say they die. By that ayah is not permitted to marry other women. So this is Surah Al-Ahzab, verse 52. And then the verse that abrogated that, according to majority of the ulama, is the verses, Ya ayyuhan nabi ahlalna laka azwaja. O messenger, O prophet, we have made it halal for you to marry in whomever you please. And that is in Surah Ahzab, verse 50. So that's the abrogating verse. And it's verse 50. The one that was abrogated came after, which is 52. In the tartib, in the order of the mushaf, not in how it was revealed. So that's just another example he gave of where the abrogating verse precedes the abrogated verse in the mushaf. Then he goes on to give you the types of naskh, the different types of abrogation in the Qur'an. He says, وَالنَّسْخُ لِلْحُكْمِ وَلِلتِّلَاوَةِ أَوْ بِهِمَا كَآيَةِ الرَّضَاعَةِ. Naskh can be for the ruling, the legal ruling itself, or the recitation of the verse, or both of them. So what we have are 3 types of abrogation, where you can have the abrogation of the ruling itself, but the verse is still in the Qur'an. The verse was not removed. So the verse is not abrogated. When we say the verse is not abrogated, we're talking about the ruling of the verse. Now, let me try to express this properly. Earlier we defined naskh, abrogation, as the removal of a ruling. Now we're talking about the removal of a verse. A verse is not a ruling. So we're saying technically when we say the verse has been abrogated, its recitation, what we mean is it's the ruling of it being an act of worship to recite it, that has been lifted. So it is the ruling that is lifted. Because that ruling is lifted, that verse can no longer be recited as ibadah, as part of the Qur'an. So it being sahih, it being valid, the ruling of validity of it being recited as Qur'an has been lifted, therefore it is removed from the mushaf. Its ruling of Qur'aniyya is moved. So it's not you get the point, it's the ruling, and the effect of the ruling being lifted is that the ayah is no longer there. So anyway, the first type is the legal ruling being abrogated, but the ayah still remaining in the mushaf. So the ruling of it being Qur'an is not lifted, but the legal ruling is lifted. Like we know that, for example, the prohibition of intoxicants came in 3 states, 3 levels, right? All those ayat are still in the Qur'an. لا تقربوا الصلاة وأنتم سكارى. It's still in the Qur'an, we still recite it. Don't approach the prayer while you're drunk. It means you can be drunk, just don't pray in a drunken state. Then that has been lifted. So that's the first type. The legal ruling is lifted, but the verse still remains Qur'an. The second type is as lit tilawa, where the recitation of it is lifted. It's no longer part of the Qur'an, but the ruling might still remain. The legal ruling might still be there, but the ayah is no longer an ayah of the Qur'an because its ruling of being Qur'an has been lifted. Like the verse وَالشَّيْخُ وَالشَّيْخَةُ إِذَا زَنَيَا فَرْجُمُوهُمَا الْبَتَّ نَكَالًا مِنَ اللَّهِ وَاللَّهُ عَزِيزٌ حَكِيمٌ. That the adulterer and the adulteress stone them as a punishment from Allah, and Allah is most powerful and wise. So this is not in the Qur'an. The ruling is still there. Because the Prophet ﷺ implemented it and the companions implemented it. So Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu said that this is something that we recited in the Qur'an. Ala ahdi Rasulillah. We recited it during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And then Umar ibn Khattab said, فَرَجَمَ النَّبِي. The Prophet ﷺ stoned, فَرَجَمْنَا, and we stoned people as a punishment. Now the ruling was not lifted, but the ayah was lifted. That verse that we just mentioned. And there's a difference of opinion concerning the wordings of the ayah. That word that I just recited, some say that was the exact ayah based on the hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari that Umar ibn Khattab recited it and Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha recited it with those words. Al-Qadi Iyad rahimahullah ta'ala in Sharh Sahih Muslim said that that wasn't the exact words. That was the meaning of the ayah. When Umar ibn Khattab mentioned these words, he didn't mean this was the exact ayah. This was the meaning of the ayah. The ruling is still there because the Prophet ﷺ did it, the companions did it. Which means if the companions are implementing it after the Prophet ﷺ is no longer there, then they understood that the ruling was still implementable. And then the fuqaha after them maintained it. This is something that it's mujma' alay. There's ijma' on it among the early fuqaha. So everybody understood that the ruling remained, but the ayah is no longer recited. And then the third category is where both the ruling and the verse is mansukh. The legal ruling and the ayah, both of it is mansukh, has been abrogated. And the example of that he gave, he said, كَآيَةَ الرَّضَاعَةِ, like the ayah concerning the nursing of the babies. Yani how many times must a baby be nursed by a woman in order for that woman to be counted as the baby's milk mother, with all of the legal implications of being having a milk relationship. So the ayah first started out by 10. عشرة رضعات, 10 complete رضعات. I don't know how to translate that. Complete feeding. So you're talking about 10 complete, not drops, but complete feeding, where the baby drinks to the point where he stops. That happens 10 times. Then that was replaced, the ruling of it was replaced by the ayah that says خمس رضعات, 5 nursings, 5 complete feedings. And then that one was abrogated in terms of recitation, but the ruling still remained according to the Shafi'i school, not according to the Hanafis and the Hanbalis and the Malikis. The ruling also did not remain. In the Shafi'i school, it's 5. According to some of the other madhabs, it's 1 complete feeding. So this ayah, yani khams rada'at, is both nasikh and mansukh. The ayah of 5 complete feeding is both an abrogating and an abrogated verse. The ulama said this is the only ayah in the Qur'an like it, because it abrogated the first one, which is 10, and then it became abrogated in terms of recitation, but the ruling still remains according to that. So it's both abrogating and abrogate. It was abrogated, and it was also a verse that abrogated something else. Then he says, وَالثَّالِث عَشَرْ وَالرَّابِعَ عَشَرْ, the 13th and the 14th sections. المعمول به مدة معينة وما عمل به واحدة. So the 13th and the 14th sections concerning that which is applicable for a specific period of time and that which was applicable or implemented only once. So he's saying that some verses of the Qur'an, the application of it in terms of the legal ruling was specific to very specific periods of time. And there are verses in the Qur'an that was only implemented once, and then the ruling became abrogated. So he says, كآية النجوى الذي لم يعمل منهم بها مذ نزلت إلا علي وساعة قد بقيت تماما وقيل لا بل عشرة أياما. So he gave one example of both categories. See, he separated these two things because he labeled them 13 and 14. That which remained for a period of time and that which is implemented only once. But he only gave one example. And the reason for that is because some of the ulama say this same example was only implemented once, and some say no, but the ruling was there for 10 days. And other opinions, but some say 10 days, some say 5 days, some say 3 days. So that one example, if you consider the difference of opinion, would serve as an example of both categories. So he says, like the ayah of Najwa, يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا ناجيتم الرسول فقدموا بين يدي نجواكم صدقة. O you who believe, if you have private consultation with the Prophet ﷺ, then present some charity. So some of the ulama says for nadab, it was a recommendation, some say it was wajib. So this ayah was revealed, and he says, الذي لم يعمل منهم بها مذ نزلت إلا علي. Like the verse of the private consultation, since its revelation except Ali, which none implemented. So nobody except Imam Ali radiallahu anhu, the Sahabi, only he implemented this ayah. He had a dinar, and he took that dinar and he bought 10 dirhams. So every time, his intention was every time he consult with the Prophet ﷺ, he would give a dirham. And only he implemented this, and he mentioned it himself in a hadith collected by Imam al-Tirmidhi. And there are differences in the narration of the hadith of Imam al-Tirmidhi and the one collected by others. But the idea was he was the only one who implemented this, and then the ayah was mansukh. So nobody implemented this except Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu. And then he said, وَسَاعَةً قَدْ بَقِيَتْ تَمَامًا. This ayah was only there for a moment. Sa'a, now we translate it in modern Arabic into an hour, but sa'a just means a moment, a small measure of time. It doesn't mean an hour as we know an hour. The measurement of time came later, right? At the time where the Qur'an and the Prophet ﷺ, when they were there, 60 minutes was not an hour. So anything that talks about sa'a at that time was not talking about an hour in that strict sense. So some people say it remained only for a short moment, and others say no, 10 days. And some of the ulama reject that opinion because they're saying that if nobody except Ali radiallahu anhu implemented it, but it was there for 10 days, then that would mean that none of the companions consulted with the Prophet ﷺ for 10, privately for 10 entire days. And there's no report in the seerah. If that happened, it would have been reported in the seerah for 10 entire days. Nobody had private consultation. That would have been an event that is mentioned in the seerah. And it's not mentioned in the seerah. Therefore, it couldn't have been for 10 days. And then some of them also argue that the companions, no matter how poor they were, they would have found a way within 10 days to get the money to consult with it. Like if they're saying that they couldn't afford it, these are companions. They would sell anything they can. They would do anything that they can. They would do any type of work necessary within a 10-day to have consultation with the Prophet ﷺ. So the more likely opinion is that it was only for a short time, within a single day. Ali radiallahu anhu did it, nobody else did, because it was mansukh. And then he goes on to the 6th link. We'll try to finish the entire book in the next session, inshallah ta'ala. So hopefully the next session will be the last, and we'll try to complete the book then, inshallah. هذا وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين.